everyone, and welcome back to part one of our Social Contracts podcast brought to you by the League of Women Voters of Arizona. I'm GraceMarie Theesfeld, your host for today's episode. Today, we're going to continue our conversation on the Declaration of Independence, exploring its meanings and looking for more modern applications. 250 years ago, the Declaration of Independence did more than announce freedom. It declared a social contract. It said that the government exists only within the consent of the governed, that the government has a duty to secure the rights and representation of the people. Those principles, liberty, justice, accountability, became the foundation for the Constitution. And just over a decade later, they were written into the Bill of Rights. Freedom of speech and press, the right to assemble, freedom of religion, due process, equal protection. The Declaration of Independence voiced the grievances. The Bill of Rights set down the remedies. Together, they defined what we the people expect from our government. The colonists were demanding a government that served the people, not the other way around. And today, those expectations remain urgent. Joining me for today's conversation are several fabulous fellow college students in Arizona, Mikah, Ari, and Emra. The grievances in the Declaration of Independence can feel like a long catalog of complaints, but they really weren't random at all. We've talked about how they revealed a pattern of power used to control, to silence, and to weaken the people. And just a reminder that in this podcast series, we've grouped the 27 grievances from the Declaration into 6 key themes: violations of representative government and self-governance, abuse of judicial power, taxation without representation, economic restriction and control, military oppression, and acts of tyranny and war. There are 6 themes, but they all carry the same message. For our discussion today, we're going to focus on the colonists' feelings towards acts of aggression in a system that was, in essence, rigged against them, the people. To start the conversation off, let's begin by listening to the listed grievances numbers 23, 24, 26, and 27 for us by Emra.
Grievance 23. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. Grievance 24. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. Grievance 26. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. Grievance 27. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions.
Thank you, Emra. Panelists, let's jump into our discussion questions for today. The first of those being, in what ways do modern governments and institutions show a form of abdication of responsibility towards marginalized groups or territories? And how does this erosion of trust and neglect contribute to feelings of alienation and abandonment among the governed?
Yeah, I think we see this a lot of the time, governments failing to serve certain communities. And I think that's like neglect through disaster relief a lot of the time, or underfunded schools, or kind of ignored infrastructure. And I think it creates a lot of feelings of abandonment and really erodes that trust in government from those people. And I think leaves people feeling kind of alienated and unsure of what to do, similar to how the colonists felt abandoned by the crown. But I think, especially this idea of disaster relief, we see a lot of the time is like determinant on like partisan politics. If something happens in a red state and we, have a Democratic president or vice versa, there's those like conversations and people use it as kind of like a political chess piece. Which is sad. And I think also a huge thing about infrastructure, again, like as the richest country in the world, but you can very much tell if you're in a wealthy community or not, just because, and I think in Arizona, this is a huge thing you'll notice, is if you're in a wealthy community, there's way more trees. And it seems like a simple thing, but especially in Arizona where it is very, very hot, trees and shade cover are important. But if you go to low income communities and you just look down a suburban street, there's really no trees. And that means the asphalt is incredibly hot, the house is, degrading because of the heat and the sun and all these different things. And so I think just something as simple as that kind of shows to people that one group of people is more important than the other to the government just because of the amount of trees in a place. So
Yeah. Micah, I'm so glad you brought up the point of ecology as a means of like being almost a barrier of like systemic racism, because you have communities like Scottsdale where it is very lush and very green because it's a more wealthy community and people have the money to pay these super high water bills. And then you go to poorer areas of Phoenix and that is not the case. And in Tucson, especially, there is no Scottsdale in Tucson. And so almost all of Tucson, there's no grass. And I just think it's very interesting because then, you know, like when I come up to Phoenix for whatever, I always notice like, wow, it's so much greener, like in Phoenix and in Scottsdale and a lot of these areas. I think it's really interesting. And like, especially people love coming to Arizona and like using all of the nice resources of Arizona, like the sunshine and the nice temperatures in the wintertime. And then they stay and fund these massive resorts. But these massive resorts are displacing people. They're sucking up all the water that we so desperately need. And they strategically put them in areas where it will inconvenience other people who would have otherwise needed access to that water. And they very, very not oftenly give people anything in exchange.
Yeah, and I think that we see a lot of racial gerrymandering as well. And I think it's funny because I was watching a Dance Moms episode.
Yeah, so
and
real.
they were doing a dance about the Jim Crow laws in 1960, and the moms were talking about like segregation and, oh, well, I thought segregation was outlawed. And there were two African American dance moms there, and one of them lives in St. Louis, and she's like, no, segregation still happens in practice by societies, by cities, because the way just like the home ownership and the realtor, like, you know, property is placed and like kind of the system, only like this specific area is for that race, and it's poor, and it's like really sad. And I'm like, wow, we're in 2025 and we're still experiencing this. And I think it has a lot to do with the government neglecting these groups of people, and like especially the African American community. Like after the Jim Crow laws, they were neglected and nothing was done to sort of like reconstruct this minority and society. So I think that our government can do better, and overall in rhetoric as well. I think that you know, we've seen the death of Charlie Kirk and the rise of this white nationalist, white Christian movement. And it's so destabilizing to our diverse society here in the U.S. That like, oh, if you're not this religion or this race, then you don't belong. That's sort of like the thing that's coming across. And I think it's really making a lot of people feel like un-American, which is crazy.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And I think one of the things that I've been thinking about too is, and so the question, you know, how do governments show like abdication or responsibility toward like a certain group? And I think of, you know, the empowerment scholarship accounts or the universal vouchers in Arizona, because, you know, it is the duty of a state government to, you know, provide public education to the people. But right now in Arizona, we're seeing kind of this abdication of that because we are funding already wealthy families to go and use and go to private education in private schools at the detriment of the, you know, over 80% of families who choose public education in the state of Arizona. And I think people are beginning to realize that. And I think also it goes to point that, you know, in 2017, Arizona voters said no to universal vouchers, but then the state legislature said, well, we'll do it anyway. And so it's like kind of, it goes back to that idea of, you know, losing trust within the institution itself, because people, you know, they feel like their voice doesn't matter because they're going to do what they want at the end of the day, no matter what. And also shows kind of, the lack of responsibility on the end of the government, because public education is one of the only systems across the entire country that Americans have in terms of the government. We don't have universal health care or anything. Public education really is the only system that has been in place. So I think that is a very large kind of abdication by our state government right now.
Yeah.
I think a large abdication as well is just healthcare in general, because people of color have harder time accessing healthcare. And so I feel like that's a big thing, where if you don't have access to healthcare, you can literally more likely to die. And that is really a way of just renouncing and showing that you don't care about a group of people by restricting access to basic healthcare, not just healthcare in emergency situations, but preventative care as well. And I feel like if we don't care for our people, something bigger will happen.
Yeah, you make a really great point. And I think the only other government institution that we haven't brought up yet is policing and law enforcement. And to me, it feels like an abdication of responsibility toward marginalized groups and communities that we have not seen police and law enforcement reform yet. It feels very frustrating, and it really plays into this language of erosion of trust and neglect, where you have such a large proportion of people who go out and try to live their day-to-day lives and feel like there isn't a law enforcement agency that they can actually trust to protect them safely. It just really grinds my gears. It's like alienating a group of people. It's so frustrating. Okay, we'll move into our second question here. This grievance speaks to great destruction caused by the will of the British government, talking about grievance number 24. Are we seeing state-sponsored violence today, and is the social contract able to be upheld, when the government is waging war against its own people?
Well, I think a clear example of this is the fact that the National Guard is being deployed in many cities right now, and that is quite literally state-sponsored violence, like going against people who are protesting and just being deployed in places where it's not needed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think showing force by using the military sends a really clear message to citizens that they, instead of being protected and backed by their government, the government is suspicious of them and is actually waging war against them when they're just exercising their free speech and free assembly rights. And I even saw, like, back in June when there were a lot of no kings and ICE protests, the FBI was going to people's houses because people were being identified, and they were being questioned about oh, why are you doing this? What are your motives? You're against your own government. And it's no, we're holding our government accountable because what they're doing is morally wrong.
Yeah.
And it feels like we're being punished for that. And it really shows the erosion of those democratic values and norms that we work so long to uphold. And yeah, I think also the people in the military feel like they're not being supported. So it's sort of like a double-edged sword. You can't win either way.
Yeah. I think in Grievance 24 as well, it talks about plundered seas, ravaged coasts, towns burnt down, and people's lives destroyed. And that to me is another form of state-supported violence, where you have people who have been affected by natural disasters, or what have you. Even I think with the government being shut down, I probably sound like a broken clock, but depriving people of food is a form of violence. And so when they talk about all these ways in which the government has, usurped our resources and reduced us down to nothing, that is another form of state-supported violence, because nothing is being done about it to fix it.
And I also think destroying the lives of people doesn't have to be physical or like outward destroyment is
Right.
if that's a way to phrase it. But it can definitely be emotional and mental. Like I'm thinking about all the families that are being torn apart and destroyed because they don't want to show their citizenship papers, which is totally your right. You know, you don't have to own or prove anything to anyone. But it's really also like destroying the emotional like capacity of people, if that makes sense, because I feel like we expect the government to take care of us and uphold their end of the social contract when we are law-abiding citizens and doing everything right, and when it's not being done like that, you're like, oh, well, that's great. Like I feel bad.
No, seriously.
Yeah.
Our third question today: in what ways does this grievance highlight the tension between loyalty, survival, and morality in times of war?
Well, one thing that I think of is the way the military functions in today's society, the incentives that are used for people to join the military. Like some people, especially like lower class people, they have to join the military because it provides access to education. It provides access to some health care that they would not have otherwise. And so it's not even about loyalty to their country. It's about survival.
Yeah, and I think that that's very strategic. That is one of the only occupations in the country that offers all those benefits and the stability of like, you know, no matter what happens in the world, you will most likely have a paycheck, a place to live, and your kids will also have access to opportunities that they may not have gotten otherwise unless you took this job. And to me, that feels very strategic. And the marketing that is done to particular socioeconomic groups is also very strategic. And I think it's definitely something worth mentioning. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, and I've seen some testimonials of some veterans who are actually protesting and taking part in exercising their rights to sort of tell the government, hey, stop, no, don't do that. And, listening to them, they've done so much for their country, but what has the country done for them in return? Not a lot, because a lot of our homeless population are veterans. And elderly, and they have disabilities. And I think also listening to them, they feel particularly not proud being Americans right now because of what this administration and these institutions are doing to their own people. It's like you can't even protect or side with your own people. Like, why are we against ourselves? Like, it's crazy.
My partner's father is a veteran, and one night he was just crying about how this is not the country that he fought for. He was an active duty member, and so he was just crying about how this is not the country he fought for because of the lack of like resources that are available to people.
Yeah, definitely. I think it really highlights the connection between loyalty, survival, and morality, and how because the military targets people who they know have limited options for survival, they end up manipulating those people into doing things that morality-wise they might not otherwise have ever done or ever wanted to do. But because they need a means to survive, they end up doing things and participating in activities that they might not ever want to do. And this comes to mind especially when we think about the National Guard. I saw a couple videos circulating of like National Guard members who are being interrogated by like protesters and people who were discussing different issues like out in public, and you can just tell that they don't want to be there. Like you can just tell like the look on their face, like they know that they're ashamed of what they're participating in and what they're doing, but they don't have a choice. They're contractually obligated to go and do these things even though they don't want to. And I can't imagine how frustrating and paralyzing it must feel to have maybe even tried to nobly sign up to do something of, I really want to make impact in my country and in my world, only to end up being deployed to Washington, D.C. and stand around to intimidate people.
Yeah. I think what you bring up really highlights like that dichotomy of like, do we comply to survive or kind of resist at like a personal risk in like our society right now? And I think it brings up kind of like the value of like people who are putting themselves out there to run for office or who are serving as elected officials, or even just like the everyday people who are knocking doors or just like engaged in advocacy work, because they're putting themselves out there at a personal risk. And so I think, you know, it's important to kind of realize that and then like applaud all those people who are continuing to kind of do all this work in times that are, you know, maybe, you know, history repeats itself. We've been through these times before, but it feels new. It feels kind of something that they understand that risk. You know, I think about, you know, there's State Senator Annalise Ortiz in Arizona, who has for the last few months faced so much backlash for what she's been doing and what I think is serving her community and providing valuable information in terms of, you know, where ICE is and, you know, providing that, you know, information to her constituents, and, you know, has faced lots of backlash from national news or from members of other members of the state legislature. And so like she has chosen to put herself kind of at this risk to stand up for what she believes our country can be.
That's very noble.
And so I think, you know, that kind of goes back to, you know, the colonists were kind of put in these impossible choices to make. And they were, you know, facing an oppressive kind of regime, but still made that decision to stand up. And you know, we only hear, there's so many stories of people who stood up back and during the revolution that we probably have never heard of. And so it takes a lot of people standing up in a lot of different ways to kind of push back against it.
Yeah, 100%. I want to get you all to share your opinion on how you think people feel about loyalty to the United States today, because that kind of exists on a spectrum as well. And I think that that's just such an interesting discussion. I think I have seen a lot of people, I feel like with everything going on, it kind of drives people to feel like they have to pick a side. But I want to hear what you guys have to say about it, what you think.
My kind of belief is that being loyal to the United States does not mean you think it's perfect. You can think the United States is deeply flawed and fight for changes within the United States because you're loyal to it and because you want it to be the best like version of itself that you know it can be.
Yeah, I mean, I think I go back to a lot of the time I believe in America and I'm loyal to America as an ideal and as an idea. Ronald Reagan said this one thing that I really love, actually. But he said, and I'll kind of paraphrase it, but, you know, if I live in France, it doesn't mean I'm a Frenchman. Or if I live in Italy, it doesn't mean I'm an Italian. But America is the one unique place in the world where if you come and live in America, then you'll actually be an American. And I
very
think that,
rare Ronald Reagan W. Very, very rare.
And I think, you know, that's the ideal of an America that, you know, I want to be loyal to.
Yeah, that is actually a very good quote. I like that.
I love your guys' responses, and I think that it goes to show that our country ebbs and flows. Like, we're not going to be in this period forever. Like, after every low, like, there's light at the end of the tunnel. And I think for me, in my position, it's so unique. As a first-generation American, obviously I have ties to my parents' country and my ethnicity, but I think America has given my family and I so much in terms of opportunity. And I think, yeah, absolutely, like, I'm proud to live in America and be an American, but that doesn't mean I have to give up my other cultural identities as well. So yeah,
I agree. And I want to emphasize again what Ari said about, you know, you can be critical of America without hating America. I, in my personal life, have caught fire for being, you know, so critical of America and what's going on. And I think sometimes in other situations that can translate into an interpretation of, oh, well, you must be anti-American. No, the opposite. I am pro-American, and I want every American to be able to experience the, not even like the American dream, but the ability to live their life as they see fit. and to survive comfortably. And we just don't see that right now. And I feel like that is really something worth fighting for.
Yeah, and you want the country to live up to its ideals.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It always makes me kind of reflect back on circumstances where I have seen that. And there have been really beautiful moments, I think, in the sea of darkness politically, where I've seen people come together to organize in community gatherings. And that's a very diverse population. You know, you have people from every single walk of life coming to support this initiative. And I think that that's really beautiful. And again, something to cling on to as we kind of like struggle and pull ourselves through these times, is that even though the struggle exists historically and presently, a resistance will also come up and people will come together to organize and pull through. Okay, we'll move on to our last question. What does this grievance reveal about the Declaration's authors' used language to justify rebellion while significantly dehumanizing Indigenous groups?
Yeah, guys, I gotta be honest. I felt a little uneasy and uncomfortable.
I don't blame you.
reading that grievance, and I think, you know, GraceMarie, when we talked about it, you were like, "It's a slur, absolutely."
It feels like it,
because that language is so dehumanizing, and like it paints a whole community that was living here
living here first.
And like, you know, called this land their home, and then all of a sudden these colonists come colonize, looking for economic freedom and fleeing from religious persecution. But that doesn't mean that you're treating another group of people horribly. And I think at the time, Darwin's the social Darwinism was so prevailing, and in terms of like what was the higher race and this and that, and we see this racial rhetoric being propagated, and so obviously we have to criticize and hold our founders accountable for what they did, owning slaves, not recognizing these indigenous groups and populations, excluding them from the Declaration of Independence, and also women as well, and not land-owning people. So yes, this declaration did a lot in terms of laying the groundwork and the foundation for our country and the democracy and the ideals, but also what work was left in terms of social inclusion and cohesiveness.
Yeah, agreed 10 times over.
And I think we see today, I mean, if you have seen since the beginning of this now Trump administration and on social media, the amount of kind of like World War I, World War II propaganda that comes out on social media, I think is really scary. And the things we see said against a lot of the time Mexican immigrants in the United States, and the, you know, again, very similar dehumanizing terms that we see against this population, or, you know, and I think that leads to, you know, they're trying to kind of shift the perspective and have people kind of agree with the Trump administration that, you know, immigrants are stealing American jobs, or all of these different things, these lies that are consistently fed through the media or through the administration. And I think it's a very similar situation to what we saw, you know, 150, 200 years ago, and is what is happening now. So.
Yeah. Mikah, I really want to touch very briefly on what you said about the dehumanizing language. I am a psychology major, and I've spent a lot of time trying to understand the influence of language that we use. And kind of as someone who's interested in a social work track as a career, I think it's very important to use specific language. So it's important to know where words come from. And when we talk about language that is purposefully used to describe someone in dehumanizing terms, it others them. It makes them seem like they are not worthy of these rights and these forms of representation and these very, very basic means of survival. And from a political standpoint, I think it's very clear that the administration is aware of that. Politicians are aware that if you can make a group of people out to be someone who is a criminal or attempting to harm you or all these other things, psychologically it switches your pathway to kind of viewing it as like, oh, well, this is an enemy. Like, we
Right.
need to unite against this perceived enemy. And the perceived enemy is not real. It's not an actual threat to you. And it distracts people from the actual threats to their safety and livelihood.
Yeah, it allows them to kind of craft a narrative in their head
Yeah.
to kind of justify their hatred against another population.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
And I think it's really dangerous because of the phrase, like, within your question of, like, justifying rebellion, because we'll slowly see this escalate more and more until we are justifying violence against immigrants right now, and, like, separating them from our families, and, like, extreme, I don't know how to phrase it, like, just, like, extreme uses of force against people just for existing within this country.
Right. Yeah, it's very, very concerning. And I think it speaks volumes to some of the more uglier sides of America that people don't like talking about, because people want to live in a world where we feel like progress is being made and reform is happening. And two of those things can be true at the same time. You know, we can be inching and climbing towards reform and social change while also still very reasonably acknowledging the fact that, you know, America is historically and institutionally violent. And we see that in our founding documents that talks about people in these horrible, horrible words. And it makes a lot of things kind of click as to why people still feel comfortable using that language today, because we don't have those discussions about this is the side effect and the consequence of what happens when you use this kind of language. And then you see it ingrained into society for hundreds and hundreds of years.
Yeah, and it almost always gets painted towards the same groups and minorities that have historically been excluded. And like we've seen the erosion of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and that, I guess, not program, but I guess initiative has really incorporated these historically excluded minorities into places of employment where they couldn't have even dreamed of before, and has done a lot to make these people feel included in society and feel American. And now all of a sudden we just get rid of it, and then we're back to where we started, and it just perpetuates this racism.
Yeah, definitely. As we've seen today, the grievances listed in the Declaration of Independence weren't just a random list of complaints. They reflected deeper concerns about representation, justice, and the abuse of power. Thank you for joining us for Episode 8 of Social Contract in Action podcast, Breaking Away from Acts of Aggression, brought to you by the League of Women Voters of Arizona. We hope today's discussion gave you new insights into the Declaration of Independence and the way its principles still echo in our civic life today.
Thank you for joining us for part 1 of this podcast series. We hope to see you again for future installments.